Now, the sort of things I'm talking about are pneumatic DPs. I'm going to describe pneumatic DPs. You may have seen pneumatic DPs. To be completely frank with you, I think it's pretty unlikely you'll end up working with pneumatic DPs. But the principle behind the way a pneumatic DP works is the same as the principle for a valve positioner and an I to P. So by describing how pneumatic DPs work, I'll be able to explain to you how valve positioners and I to Ps work. So although we're unlikely to see the things, it's the same principles and the same parts. So I'm going to go through how a pneumatic DP works. The problem we had was that we had lots of different tanks, and all the tanks were different heights. We could have had a 5-meter tank and a 3-meter tank and a 20-meter tank. But for all of these different tanks, what I needed was, I needed 20 to 100 kPa output to represent 0 to 100% full. So I needed to be able to take the different tank height and give me a 0 to 100% signal. At the bottom of the tank was a pressure, and as the tank filled up, the pressure would increase and decrease. So I needed to be able to take the reading of the pressure at the bottom of the tank and translate that into 20 to 100 kPa. And that's what a pneumatic DP does. It consists of several important parts. There's a diaphragm here, or a capsule, where the tank pressure comes in. On the other side, this one is open to atmosphere, so it's reading gauge pressure. That is attached to a force beam. It's a balance beam, it's a seesaw. And the force beam is able to pivot. Now what's very important is I can move this pivot backwards and forwards. So this pivot moves backwards and forwards. And of course, as that pivot moves backwards and forwards, it changes the leverage. Changes the leverage effect I get. Over this side, I've got a restrictor, which is a very, very small hole in a piece of metal. I've got a nozzle and a flapper. The flapper is attached to the force beam, and if the force beam comes downwards, the flapper will close the nozzle off. Also over here I have a bellow, or a feedback bellow it's called. And then I have a gauge which is reading the pressure inside that bellow. Okay, here's how this thing works. The tank's half full. The balance beam is in balance, and what's happening is the pressure from the tank, which is pushing that upwards, is being balanced by the pressure from the bellows, which is pushing that side upwards. The bellow's got pressure in it because it's being inflated. It's being inflated by the air coming in. This is air here, mains air coming in. So mains air goes through the restrictor. Some of it escapes out of the nozzle, but what doesn't escape out from the nozzle inflates the bellow, which pushes that beam up. Now, with the tank half full, the whole thing is in balanced, and I've got 60 kPa signal coming out just there. Okay. Now, I suddenly fill the tank up. As I suddenly fill the tank up, the pressure upwards is much more. Now, the balance beam is forced downwards. As the balance beam is forced downwards, the flapper closes the nozzle. Oh, goodness. Can't spell closes, can I? The flapper closes off the nozzle. So the nozzle is closed off. Because the air is not able to escape anymore, what it then does is it inflates the bellow. As it inflates the bellow pushes back upwards, which brings the beam back into equilibrium. But now the beam is in equilibrium with very much more pressure in the bellows. Now it's in equilibrium with 90 kPa in the bellows. The bellow doesn't carry on inflating, because as soon as the beam comes up, the flapper lifts up off the nozzle, and now some of the air can escape from the nozzle again. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to suddenly let lots of liquid out of the tank. Dunk. Because the bellow was inflated, what happens is the beam lifts up this way. Now, the flapper is completely off the nozzle. All of the air escapes out of the nozzle. Because the nozzle is very, very much bigger than the restrictor, in relative sizes, the nozzle would be about that big, the restrictor would be about that big. Because the nozzle is very much bigger than the restrictor, air can't get in quickly enough to replace the air which is all escaping out from the nozzle. So the bellow deflates, and it comes back into an equilibrium point with some air leaking, but it comes back into an equilibrium point. This time we've got 60 kPa on the gauge again. So that's the working principle of the force beam with the flapper nozzle bellow combination. Does everybody understand that? Okay then. Now I have big problems with this system. The amount of air available for my signal, the volume of air available, is 3 parts of stuff all. Because the volume of air is the amount that manages to make its way through that restrictor. Remember, the restrictor is tiny. And the amount of air that doesn't leak out through the nozzle and flapper. Remember, the nozzle's quite big. So there's very little volume of air available to be my signal, and very little volume of air available to inflate the bellow. To fix this problem up, I use a thing called a relay. You see, the low volume of air gives me 4 problems. Low volume for the signal. The whole thing is very slow to respond because there's not much air volume to inflate the bellow. It tends to have linearity problems, and it tends to very slowly oscillate. To fix all of these problems, I use a relay. This is a volume, let me get a better pen. It's a volume amplifier. So, what happens is I put signal pressure in there, and I have mains air there, mains air coming in here, and I have output air coming there. The output is the same pressure as signal. So the output comes out at the same pressure as the signal. If you look at this, it's exactly the same as a PRV, but it doesn't have a spring on the top. Instead, we're using the signal pressure. So the output air comes out exactly the same pressure as the signal air, but because the pipe size is bigger, we have very, very much more volume. So it's a volume amplifier. Now, by stuffing my relay in just there, my volume amplifier, my relay, is responsible for inflating the bellow and giving the signal to the output. Now the thing is nice and fast acting. And I've got loads and loads of signal volume available to go out and work my gauge. I also put a little 0 screw on there. That little 0 screw puts a little bias on of 20 kPa, because I want my signal to go from 20 to 100 kPa. So I've got a little 20 kPa spring there. Now what I've got is essentially a pneumatic DP. The rest of this is all to do with folding. Anything which can move this beam up and down, I can now use to generate 20 to 100 kPa. Other things which can move this beam up and down, I could put a bimetallic strip on there, and then I'll get 20 to 100 kPa based on temperature. I could put an electromagnet on there, and then I'll get 20 to 100 kPa, which will vary as I vary that from 4 to 20 milliamps. If I do that, then I've got 4 to 20 milliamps in, 20 to 100 kPa out. I've got an I to P converter. And that's just how an I to P converter works. Instead of having the tank on one side of the force beam, you've got an electromagnet. So that's an I to P converter as well. It's all just a case now of cleverly folding the thing up so that it fits in the box. And the way they managed to fold this up so that it fits into a tiny little I to P is extremely ingenious. So now we've got nothing more than just folding. I to Ps look like this, valve positioners look like this, DPs look like this. They've all got the important bits. They've got a nozzle, they've got a flapper, they've got a restrictor. The sort of faults that we get with pneumatic instruments, such as pneumatic DPs, I to Ps, and valve positioners. Here's the sort of faults we get. What I've got is, you can just about make it out there. It's a tiny bit of dirt. Tiny little bit of dirt. It's just coming along in my airline. And it's just made it to there now. There's my dirt. There's dirt in my airline. Everything's working just fine. And then, thunk, the dirt reaches the restrictor. Now I've got a problem. My restrictor is blocked with dirt. This dirt could be oil or water. Has blocked up my restrictor. Now, to give you an idea of a restrictor, the size of the hole in the restrictor, a restrictor typically is that big. That's the actual body of the restrictor. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pretend that I'm magnifying that. So if I take that and I magnify it, so that that's what it looks like. The hole in the middle is that big. So the hole in the middle of some restrictors is about the diameter of a human hair. It is a tiny little hole. You need a magnifying glass to see it on some restrictors. Other restrictors have got relatively big holes. You know, they might be a tenth of a millimeter across. But some restrictors have got minuscule holes. It doesn't take much dirt to block them up. Okay. When that restrictor blocks up, no air passes through. So first thing you'll notice is that there's no air coming out of the nozzle. When there's no air coming out of the nozzle, there's no air at the top side of the relay. So the next thing that happens is that the relay depressurizes and there's no signal. So one tiny little speck of dirt, the size of a human hair follicle, can block up the restrictor and stop this working. If this was a valve, then what you would see is the valve doesn't open. You're telling the valve to open and it's not opening. If this was a valve positioner. If this was an I to P, which was probably controlling a valve, you'll see the same deal. There's no output from the I to P. And probably the valve isn't opening. So that's the typical fault we get. In fact, It's 99.9% of all the faults we get with pneumatic instruments, valve positioners, I to Ps, and pneumatic DPs, is that the restrictor blocks up. It's just about the only fault we ever get. Luckily, the manufacturers know that that is the fault you're going to get. So typically, on an I to P or a valve positioner, there'll be a very, very big screw on it somewhere. And this is like real size. The screw will look about that big. It'll be a big, fat screw that you can't miss. Underneath that screw, you'll find the restrictor. Either the restrictor will be, that screw head will be part of the restrictor, or underneath that screw will be the restrictor. Now, you never undo that screw with the air on, because if you do, the restrictor will come out and shoot across the mill and end up embedded in somebody's eye. So you always turn the air off before you undo the screw. But underneath the biggest screw head you can find will be the restrictor. Typically, to fix a fault on a pneumatic instrument, you undo the screw, you get the restrictor out, you clean it, then you maybe crack a little bit of air in to make sure that there's no more water left behind, because it's going to be caused by water or oil, this. You crack a little bit of air, and water and oil should bubble out of the little hole, and when that's good, you screw the restrictor back in, and it'll all work again. This is 99.9% of all faults on valve positioners, I to Ps, and pneumatic DPs. So really, the only thing you need to know is look for the big screw, undo it, clean what's underneath there, put it back, and it will probably work. Of course, the big question is, why did it get blocked up in the first place? The reason it's got blocked up in the first place is probably because the air dryer has just broken down, or the filter's broken down, or the pneumatic receiver has just overflowed. So once you've fixed this fault, you then go back into your airline and you start finding out what's caused all of this. Here is a diagram. This is an I to P, and I've just done this. The restrictor is actually underneath that big, oh, this could show up better, couldn't it? It's underneath that screw head there. So really, you find the big screw head, you undo it, and the restrictor's underneath it. This is how a valve positioner works. Now, with a valve positioner, this thing here is showing a valve positioner. With a valve positioner, we don't have a feedback bellow. Instead, feedback from the valve positioner is supplied by a cam which is attached to the valve itself, so that as the valve moves, the cam turns round and pushes the beam up and down. This valve positioner is being fed 4 to 20 milliamps. So I've got 4 to 20 milliamps. So effectively, it's got a built-in I to P converter. I'm putting 4 to 20 milliamps in, and I'm getting valve position out. You see, the valve would be attached to that bit, valve. Okay, so that is the basic principle of pneumatic instruments. It's the basic principle of pneumatic DP. Where you won't be seeing pneumatic DPs, you will be seeing I to Ps, you will be seeing valve positioners. Both of them have got the same thing that's going to go wrong. It's the restrictor. That's what's going to go wrong with your valve positioner. That's what's going to go wrong with your I to P. You look, you find the big fat screw head, and inside of there is going to be your restrictor. Take it out, you clean it, you put it back in, and it's all good. Of course, we don't tell people it's as easy as that.